Hello, folks. Thanks very much for this opportunity to speak here today. I know I'm the last of a line of great speakers that we have at the third issue of the Ferns conference. And the title of the presentation today is going to be The Medieval Clone Church Continuity Within the Community. Now, I chose this theme because although the church has been in ruins for several centuries, it's being maintained as experienced continuity through the reuse of its graveyard up until the 1960s, and through the recycling of its materials in other buildings in Ferns. And also more recently through the Clone Church Conservation Project, in which we undertook a graveyard survey of the site. And we're going to be looking at the history beyond the headstones and to try and find out a little bit about the people that are buried in that. And just to give you an idea of what we're going to be talking about today. So I have it laid out in 4 sections. The first section we'll be talking about the church setting and its history. And then we're going to look at the actual project itself and the results of the graveyard survey. And this will follow on with a clone church, a possible monastic origin for a 12th century. It's architecturally dated from the 12th century based on its features, but it's often associated with St. Aidan of Ferns. So we're going to be looking at that connection and also some exciting discoveries we made with crop marks in the adjacent field during the summer. And then we're going to finish off with archaeological excavations on monastic ferns. My thesis topic was archaeological excavations in the history of ferns. And we're going to look at what it can tell us beneath the ground in relation to St. Aidan and his ecclesiastical settlement here. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Clone Church, it's set about 2 kilometres south of the village of Ferns, on the opposite side of the River Bann. It's located in a flat field adjacent to the public road. You can see it here on the right hand side. And it's located just on the edge of the valley of a northwest to southeast flowing stream. Now, the remains of the church consist of the north and south walls, which are partially intact. Nothing remains today of the eastern wall, where the chancel would have been set, so unfortunately we can't tell the complete length of the structure, but we're lucky in that the western gable survives the full length, and it contains an ornate west doorway. And you can see the church is set within an oval enclosure of a stone wall and contains mostly burials of 19th century. And this is just the video we undertook as part of a drone survey of the site, and it'll give you a better idea of what it looks like, if I can get it going. Sorry about that, folks. I was working every week up in the lead up to this, but of course these things happen. But sure, just to give you an idea, before you can see I can see there's not much left of the church today, and it's in very bad need of repair, and the interior is overgrown. It's been fenced off by the OPW because it's in an unstable condition at present. Now, although it doesn't look like there's much left from the air, the church has some very interesting features. You can see its ornate western doorway here. It has very interesting architrave which protrude from the outer wall, and you can see chevron mouldings on the left and right hand side of these. These are what I describe as a zigzag type of pattern, and also several heads located above the doorway. Now, that it's a Romanesque church. 12th century, and that concrete lintel is not 12th century. That's a later addition added during 1915 restorations, and I'll show you images of what they originally would have looked like later on. You can see several of the figures located here. Just try to attempt to explain some of them. The figure on the left is quite a grotesque looking figure. I'm not 100% sure what he's supposed to be. Second from the left is possibly an abbot or a holy person. You can see the tonsure on top of his head. A third in from the left is a bishop with his mitred hat. And fourth in from the left we have a bearded figure, possibly of benefactory to the church. And the last 2 figures there on the right hand side are very badly worn and unfortunately can't be discerned today. Now, also surrounding the church within the graveyard there are several interesting archaeological features. These include cross slabs containing a Maltese design. You can see the one here on the left and the right hand side. Unfortunately, the one on the right hand side, we don't know its current location. And we can see another image of a Maltese cross also on the left-hand side. And the feature on the right-hand side is a sundial. It's often synonymous with Clone. You can see in the upper part, in the middle perforation, how lines radiate from this centrally out towards the edge, and that the idea is that there would have been probably some sort of a metal rod protruding from this and would have cast the shadows of the sun and used to tell the different times of the day. These two features have been recently moved from Clone Church and are currently in Tintern Abbey for safekeeping. There's also bull-on stones located within the graveyard. You can see the one here on the left-hand side, and the one on the right. This is a sketch found in Hoare's History of the County and Town of Wexford from 1911, and unfortunately, again, its whereabouts aren't known today. These are common features of early ecclesiastical sites. Their function, different interpretations. It's often said that by people that they were used as holy water fonts, but they're more likely to have been used for the grinding of wheat crops, or possibly in metalworking. Now, just to place Clone Church in a historical context. So, as I said, the church's architectural features place it within the 12th century, and the earliest reference we have for the church comes from the 13th century, where we find it as a valuable prebend and canonry. Now, a canonry was a priest member of the Bishop's Advisory Council, known as the Cathedral Chapter, so possibly would have been here in Ferns. And the prebend was a stipend granted to a canon at the time. And at the same year, we also have reference to a person being pardon me, I'm stuck for the word, confirmed in the canonry and prebend of Clone. And the Catholic Church appointed priests to the parish and church well into the Reformation, with the last one being a Nicholas Whitty. You can see the date shown here on the slides. Now, when we look at Clone, it's also important to remember that it wasn't just it functioned as a church; it functioned as a parish church. So, in terms of Clone as a Catholic parish, it existed up until the end of the 16th century, where we had the Reformation. And Reverend William Cosgrave, in his article on Clone Church, suggests that at the end of the Reformation and the introduction of the penal laws as well, but eventually the parish priests moved away from Clone, and we find that it became amalgamated with other townlands in the vicinity. In 1835, the Bishop Keating redrew the parish boundaries, and Clone, what was essentially the medieval Clone parish, became amalgamated into the modern Monageer parish. But yet we see that it was known through the locals as Clone parish well into the 12th century. In terms of Clone as a Protestant parish, the first rector was a David Reverend Brown into the early 17th century, and in 1778 Clone Church was united with the Protestant parish of Ferns. Now, it's my own thought that at this time there was possibly not enough of a congregation in Clone Church to sustain it, and maybe this is why they united it with the parish of Ferns, and perhaps by 1778 it was probably well into being a ruin. And it was eventually brought back as an independent parish in the 1830s, when the building of the new Church of Ireland in Salisbury, and it remains part as a Protestant parish today, although without the townland of Clone itself. So we should ask the question, when exactly did Clone Church go into ruin? When did it fall out of use as being a place of worship? It's suggested to have been unroofed by Reverend Cosgrave, possibly since the time of the Cromwellian invasion in 1650s. And we do have references to show that it was well in use from the 1700s, and vandalism seems to have been ripe at the building. You can see the second Lewis, in his Topographical Dictionary of Ireland in 1837, speaks of the ruins of the church of Clone. And also you can see there on the third reference down how another reference says how the Board of Works organised contractors to build a wall around the church to protect it, but in fact they took the stone from the actual church itself. So that wasn't great operations, even though the intentions were quite good. Philip Hoare in 1911, in his History of the County and Town of Wexford, describes the church's walls as clad in a thick vesture of ivory. And then there's also a reference by Graff and Flood in his History of the Diocese of Ferns in 1916 to an attempt to try and raise funds to save it. So even though it was fallen to ruin and had been vandalized by a few, there were still people who held it in some significance of some sort. To talk about the recycling of its features elsewhere within Ferns, the picture you see here on the left-hand side is of a 12th century Romanesque window, which is currently in St. Peter's Church, just located up the road. Now it's interesting because this church was built in the 16th century, and it also contains many early features, including this and 13th century Gothic windows. So obviously parts of it were recycled from elsewhere, and Denure, who was an antiquarian and visited many of historic sites around Wexford and Ireland, and drew this sketch, suggested that it's very similar. It's chevron marks, you can see in there on either side, to that we find in Clone. And this often leads to the suggestion that it was possibly taken straight from Clone and reused in St. Peter's Church. But we also have to take into account that maybe it was taken from a church elsewhere in Ferns that had similar craftsmen to that at Clone because of the same design. Elsewhere in a more recent structure, say in Mogswell, again located just across the road here, built in 1847 as part of a famine relief scheme, we see the reuse of the stones from Clone along with St. Mary's Abbey for its construction. And also you notice the little head, it's very, very badly worn. This was taken directly from Clone Church as well. And it was being amongst one of the several heads when you saw on the earlier slide. So here we have two examples of the reuse of materials from Clone Church within buildings in Ferns. Again, an example of its continuity within the community. Now, I spoke earlier of the concrete lintel, and in 1956 we had restorations undertaken by the late Father Ransom. He was a scholar, a historian, and he was also the man responsible for creating the county museum, which many of you might remember, inside Enniscorthy Castle. In an article in 1957, written in the local Echo newspaper, he describes the cleaning up of the church, and he says he found the heads which strewn around the ground, which he then placed above the doorway along with the concrete lintel, unfortunately, and he uncovered other archaeological artifacts, including 3 portions of round-headed windows and cross slabs of a possible 9th century date. And again, I talk about the association with an early ecclesiastical monastery on the site, and here we have possible evidence of that. And like I said earlier on, they used cement mortar with in an old lime building, and unfortunately the two just don't go together. And as you will see, the church is in quite a bad state today. This is the western gable. There's several large cracks of it. You can see some parts have attempted to be repointed. You can see the interior of the church looking south. You can see how they used brick to try and prop up the arch. This collapse of the western wall we see closest to the end here at the corner, this occurred more recently in the last 3 or 4 years, and the sundial was actually located directly below this, so it was luckily they moved it beforehand. And it's a shame to see it in such a state because it is actually a national monument. But thankfully the OPW are hoping to move on it very, very soon, which is much welcomed. And this is what I was talking about earlier on about the Romanesque features of the church. When we think of Romanesque, we think of round. We can see the round archway located above the door, and also the heads which were originally placed above it. But an interesting feature I've known myself is that it'd be very interesting to have someone such as Professor Tygo Keefe to re-look at this building. You can see, western doorways, inclined jambs. Is there maybe something a little bit earlier to this church? So again, this is something that the project would like to investigate in the future. And then talk about a little bit more now about the project. So the Clone Church Conservation Project started at the beginning of this year. It was run by the Ferns Heritage Archive Group, which I'm secretary. We received grant funding from the Heritage Council and through the account of 3,500. And originally we intended to undertake conservation works in the church until we found out, thankfully, that the OPW were ahead of us and planned to do this. So we were able to reallocate the money elsewhere towards a graveyard survey. And you can see the members located here. And on the far right, we have Tom Breen and his wife, and also his brother Paul, who isn't in the picture. But I would like to thank their support very much for access to the church, and they've been very supportive throughout the project. Now, initially, the first thing we had to do when we decided to undertake the graveyard survey was clean up the site. So, armed with with slash hooks and everything, every sort of garden implement you could imagine, we went and we attacked the jungle that was around the Clone Church. And you can see it's heavily overgrown here. Keep an eye on that overgrown area on the left hand side. I'll show you an image of it in a few minutes, and you'll be surprised what's there. You can see the grass was heavily overgrown. None of the headstones were able to be read, but of course, thanks to the local community, we tried to return it to some form of visibility. And this is what we found hidden underneath all of the hedge growth. So what you see there on the left hand side, after some pain and sweat, we got into it. And this is actually the only walled off area of the graveyard. It's of the Rudd family, who built the Clone House, just across the way in 1740, and they would have arrived and received lands as part of the Cromwellian invasion and lived there up until quite frequently about less than 100 years ago. So they tried to show their high status within the graveyard in Clone. And this is one of our enthusiastic members, Frank Gettings. So when we undertook the survey with the grants, we were able to employ the help of John Tierney of historicgraves.ie. And John came to us and he trained us up in how to undertake transcribing and recording of the headstones. Some of them were illegible, very hard to read, but using various techniques we were able to do so. And we undertook this survey as part of a Heritage Week event, and we invited local people from the community to come out and learn a bit more about the local heritage, and we were very pleased with the outcome of the entire project. So this was done in a systematic format, and there had been previous surveys done before, but to make sure that we didn't miss anyone buried beneath the ground, we started over again. What we did was we were broken into teams. The initial team went around and marked each individual grave, numbered them, followed by a photograph was taken of each graveyard, and then several teams followed behind, recording the details, including the dimensions, any iconography, and the names and details of the transcriptions. Now, there's various methods used to read the headstones. Number one was a rubbing, so paper was placed over the headstones, and then using carbon paper wrapped around a sponge, we rubbed it. And the idea is the carbon paper catches any indentations in it, letterings, iconography, and you can see here it shows up very well. You can see the top part of the stone, granite stone, very badly worn, couldn't even make it out with lights or anything else, and this showed it up perfectly. You can see the IHS common feature of graves and headstones, and the cross coming straight up from the H. Another technique was using mirrors. Very simple. This is done early in the morning when the sun is best, and what we essentially do is we capture the light and reflect it off of the headstones, and the same technique can be done with a torch. And just to talk about some of the headstones themselves, the man by the name of James Byrne, who was most active towards the end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s, was a local stone carver from Clone, and his iconography is very beautiful, I have to say, and you can find examples of his work up as far as Glendalough and down into parts of Waterford near Ardmore. And you can see this now. Apologies that this isn't a great picture, but you can make out a passion scene. On the far left, we have the image of the sun, which rises each morning, just as Christ rose from the dead, the Gloria. To the left of that, we have a figure of a woman with a crown around her head. possibly Mary. We have the crucified Christ in the middle with IHS, I have suffered. To the right of that, we have another image of a woman, possibly Mary Magdalene. And then on the far right, we have an image of the moon with a man in it. This goes back to the medieval belief that the angel Gabriel lived on the moon. And then we have in Excelsis Gloria written. Now, when all this data was collected, it was uploaded online, and if any of you feel like having a look at it, it's available at historicgraves.ie. Each headstone is given its own individual number, along with coordinates and details of those buried underneath. Now, this wasn't just an exercise in collecting data and uploading it online. We're trying to essentially look at the stories behind the headstones. What can we find out socially about the people? Archaeology is looking at the material culture of people to try and find out about the past, and headstones can form part of that material culture. And you see here a clone. Although this is an ongoing process, still some things I can say here today is that Clone was a shared graveyard between both Catholics and Protestants, despite an often rival history between both, and with the Reformation and such. The oldest headstone dates from 1777. Quite a few date from 1798. They may correlate with the rebellion at the time. And there's also an oral history collected of burials being found to the south of the church during ploughing. And also I was talking to a local man by the name of Alan recently who informed me that there was a cholera outbreak, and he back probably, and there's no date, probably well back in the 1800s or 1700s, and there's supposedly a mass grave to the rear of the church. So again, we're collecting all these stories and trying to amalgamate them into a single source. And also we have an example. Majority of the graves actually within the site are unmarked headstones. So these are poor people from a lesser well-off background. And then we have examples of people from a more well-off background, such as the Rudd family. So it wasn't just shared by both Catholics and Protestants, but also by rich and by poor. The outcome of the project is we have created a lasting record of Clone Church for prosperity. We've increased awareness of the site using a bottom-up approach. We're all doing this as voluntary. We're not getting paid for it. And it's all about getting the community involved. We've laid the foundation for future work on the site. We're collecting oral histories. And we're trying to hopefully, as future down the line, when all of this is completed, it'll end up in a publication. Now, to go forward to the Clone has a monastic origin. It's often stated by several scholars that Clone dates back, even though it's a 12th century church, it dates back to a monastic origin associated with St. Aidan. Graph from Flood in 1916 says that Clone was one of the oldest foundations in the Diocese of Ferns and is rightly attributed to St. Aidan. Reverend Cosgrave speaks of how it's frequently stated that it goes back to St. Aidan. And in Hoare interestingly refers to the Abbey of Clone and how it was the most ancient church in the district, and it was probably founded at the time during St. Aidan's rule. And more recently, as part of many of you might have seen up in Newgrange, they discovered a henge during the dry weather. I suppose I should explain how these features form. Essentially, if you have a dug feature such as a ditch and that's backfilled, that holds moisture better than the surrounding natural subsoil. And when the crops are turning ripe from green, those that grow above this feature tend to hold their colour for a little bit longer. And I'll speak about that in a moment. Sorry, my slides got mixed up here now. But there was excavations undertaken within the vicinity of Clone. You can see the area marked here on the red-hand side. This donates a field that was, from which in 2006 there was planning permission applied for, and as a condition that planning permission, test trenching had to be undertaken, and during which they found several features containing charcoal and slag, and these were interpreted as evidence of industrial activity, possibly connected with the monastery or medieval church at Clone. Now, metalworking is a craft that's often associated with monastic sites. So again, this possibly gives further credit to a monastic origin for the 12th century, prior to the 12th century church. Sorry about that, folks, another video didn't work. Thankfully I have a couple of slides, but when we undertook the survey, we found several features, both linear and curved, and the main features that stood out was you can see these two linear lines protruding from one end of the church. They come up from where the ground begins to slope down towards the valley stream. They curve in an east to west direction. They curve round in an east to west direction, and they seem to run into the ditch here. But the interesting thing is that at this point, the ditch is also curved. So you can see the features essentially complete a half circle around the site, and there's a possible entrance here where there's a break in the two structures. Now these are most likely represent the remains of ditches which may have had accommodating banks. Now, what essentially does this mean or tell us about the church at Clone? Well, such features are often associated with early monastic sites to delimit the sacred interiors of the church. And we know from archaeological excavations that a majority of these have been dated to the 6th and 8th century. And we know from documentary evidence that no new saints are attributed to new church foundations after the 8th century. So if you combine the Bull-on stones, the association with Saint Aidan, along with this discovery, I would advocate strongly for an early ecclesiastical origin to the church at Clone. Plus possibly one which may have been associated here with Saint Aidan himself. In terms of what it would have functioned as, I cannot say, but I know that often the size of these enclosures tells a lot of their status. And during recent geophysical investigations here to the rear of this church in the Abbey Field, they uncovered evidence of a large monastic enclosure, much larger than that at Clone. So we can say that Clone, during the time of its contemporary with the monastery here at Ferns, would have functioned with a lesser status. Now, I know there's been a lot talked about names in this conference, but you'll be glad to hear this is a positive aspect, and there's a lot in the name. And I won't attempt to pronounce the author's name because I'll only make a balls of it. But in a publication 2000, site 16, entitled Townland Names in County Wexford, there's reference made to the pre-Anglicisation of the townland name Clone, which is Clune, which often refers to a meadow. And this is often found in County Wexford context very close to ecclesiastical sites, with often the ecclesiastical site found within the Clune itself, as we have here in Clone. And they often occur adjacent to a river course where there may have been flooding, and this may have been a feature common in the time where the founder or benefactor gave land that was less better to the churchmen. So again, another possible evidence of an earlier origin to Clone. Now, we can go even further back, possibly. This is a recent discovery, and the first recorded discovery of Neolithic rock art in the county. We didn't actually come across this at all during the survey. Michael Moore of the National Monument Service was down visiting with us one day, and just as the sunlight came up at the right time, he was coming into the gateway, and this caught his eye. And you can see the several curves, oval features on the stone, and these are best associated with passage tombs. So perhaps at one point there was a passage tomb long gone within the local landscape, and the stone was taken from this and brought back here and reused as an unmarked grey headstone in Clone Church. Again, it's something that we could have further investigations on. We've recently commissioned photogrammetry of the stone, as well as several discernible headstones, so we'll hopefully have the results of those in a few weeks as well. So future project plans. So what's next? Endless possibilities, to be honest with you. Because we have evidence of a possible monastic enclosure, it would be interesting to find out a little bit more about this. We can undertake geophysic investigations of the site. More of a cheaper option is field walking for artifacts exposed during ploughing. This can often show or identify concentrations of areas where there may have been previous activity, possibly related to metalworking perhaps, if it was slag. And hopefully in the future that could lead to the possibility of community excavation. Commencing of conservation works to Clone, we're very keen to see these works being undertaken, and we're going to try and push hard for them. and making the site visitor friendly. Eventually, all of this is about delving more into the past of the medieval Clone Church, and essentially we would like to see the site open to visitors with the possible erection of interpretive panels like you have here at Ferns. Now, to move on from Clone, I'm going to discuss what was the topic of my master's thesis, excavations, and I'm going to see what can they tell us in relation to St. Aidan. But we should ask the question, what was it that brought St. Aidan to Ferns in the first place? Did he just go over the hill and say, this looks like a nice place, I'll build my church here? Or was there a bit more to it? And archaeological excavations can help us discern that question. In 2004, as part of a condition of planning permission, excavations were undertaking the housing estate opposite here in Aldercourt, in which John Kavanagh uncovered 6 to 7 cremation pits, which he thought were of late Bronze Age date. Some of these contained crushed vessels, and his interpretation was that these form part of a flat late Bronze Age cemetery located on the high ground near the river. Then again, in 2006, test trenching was undertaken in the field adjacent to that, and you see the area where the 2 red dots were marked. 2 further cremation pits were uncovered, and then in the area with the blue circle denotes, in 1998, as part of testing for a pipeline for the Ferns sewage scheme, Mary Henry uncovered several features consisting of possible post holes, burnt spreads, and also another single cremation pit, together with Bronze Age pottery. So this could advocate for an extension of the cemetery founded in Aldercourt by Kavanagh. Moving on to the Iron Age, we've more burial activity in the form of a ring ditch or barrow. This was uncovered during monitoring of works again as part of the Ferns sewage scheme, and you can see a pre-excavation photo here on the left hand side. Now, what they found inside in the ditch was burnt timbers along with 4 burials, each containing several remains, both of juvenile and of adults. Burial 4 in particular was interesting, as it was considered a high status because of the deliberate separation of an adult burial from a juvenile, and also it contained over 127 glass beads. You can see them located here on the right hand side. And you could ask the question, was this high status possibly attributed to or a precursor to the royal significance which Ferns held during the early medieval period under Duke Kinselig? So on that I would possibly ask, is there evidence for a pre-existing significance to Ferns? And is this maybe something that attracted St. Aidan? And other scholars have asked the same. Christian Corlett says that nevertheless the question that remains unclear is why Ferns was so politically important in early times. Was it purely because of St. Madogue's foundation here? Indeed, what attracted St. Mogue in this area in the first instance? Was it already a place with royal connection? It is certainly tempting to suggest that Ferns was a place of some significance long forgotten, even before the arrival of Christianity. And Edward Culleton, in his book Celtic and Early Christian Wexford, published in 1999, says the following. The question arises as to why Ferns was chosen as a monastic site. He notes that unlike many others, it was not located on a major river crossing or important land route. It seems likely that Aidan landing at Ardmine and subsequent settling at nearby Ferns was a calculated move. A branch of Duke Kinselig was already settled in the area, and Aidan, seeking to associate himself with a powerful family, made his way here. So again, we could advocate for a possible prehistoric significance to the area. And Aidan Doyle, in a publication telling the dancer from the dance in the book Memories, Essays in Memory of Billy Colfer, also suggests that there may have been prehistoric cult activity associated with Ferns. Now, what can excavations tell us about St. Aidan and his monastery? Now, unfortunately, there exists no definite evidence from archaeological excavations or material taken from the ground associated with the monastery, and this is very unusual considering the high status and the importance that we've learned today that had often held. This is not to say, though, that nothing remains. It's just possibly that the trenches haven't been dug in the right location. But what we do have is other investigations have turned up a little bit more. So I think it was in 2015, 2016, there was geophysical investigations undertaken in the field behind me. And you can see the diagram here, which is courtesy of Ger Dowling. They uncovered multiple linear features. And just notice St. Mary's Abbey there. You can see the two concentric lines, one here and another here, which were thought to form part of a monastic enclosure, like that one that I spoke of in Clone. Again, its size would suggest that Ferns was quite an important site. And also notice how it goes underneath the abbey. And it has been suggested, like Tycho O'Keefe said earlier, that the monastics may have simply moved from the original monastery to the abbey, that perhaps the building of the abbey over the inner enclosure, which would have been the most important, was a way of kind of officially closing one chapter, moving from one church into another during the Reform. Again, although excavations have failed to uncover artifacts, agricultural activities have actually. During ploughing in the field behind me here, back in the 1940s, this artifact showed up. This is a bronzed enameled book clasp, which had been used to keep closed the book. You can see evidence of millefiori glass working here, so different patterns and shade of glass. And it's quite a well-crafted piece, and is of a possibly 9th century date, so perhaps contemporary with the monastery here, Ferns. Again, these monasteries weren't just places of prayer; they were also of trade and industrial activity. Now, moving on directly from the monastery, we know that during the early medieval period, Ferns was a place of quite importance. It was the centre of the O'Kinsleague, essentially a royal site. And during 2006, in the field across the way, I spoke of the testing earlier on, two concentric ditches, about 16 metres wide, were uncovered. You can see them marked here on the map. And the excavator interpreted this as possibly forming 1/3 of a bivalid ring fort. Now, ring forts are a very common feature in the Irish landscape. A lot of people are probably familiar with them. They have an outer ditch and then an inner bank made from the upcast dug material. And that's one set of defences. And often the more set of defences it has, the more high status is considered of. With such ring fort, and these bivalid ring forts are considered multivalid because of their multiple defences. And Edwards, in her archaeology of early medieval Ireland, and also Sullivan and Downing, state that some are generally thought to be associated with high status and maybe the dwelling of the High Lord or the Ereforgal from early historical texts. And we could advocate maybe that this was the place of a high status subject during the early medieval time. Again, it's very close to the monastery in Ferns, and could I go as far to say as maybe the High King Brandov or nobleman Beck, who originally gave Aidan the lands here in the first place. So again, something to ponder. There's also significance in their setting. Kerr is quoted by O'Sullivan and Downey in 2007 as saying that their location is offered more to political geographies than to physical instances. Stout again shows various examples in his publication in 1997 about the relation between ring forts and church sites, and also Edwards notes their importance in strategic locations. Example given of that of the three sets of defences of the multivalid ring fort in Gorans. So a couple of concluding remarks. Although the medieval Clone Church is a ruin, it experiences continuity within the community through the Clone Church Conservation Project, which we hope to continue into the future. Ferns archaeological records suggest that it may have been a place of significance before Christianity, which in turn perhaps influenced St. Aidan's decision to establish the monastery here in the first place. And although excavations have failed to encounter any links with St. Aidan's monasteries, stray finds and the discovery of a large enclosure suggest it was quite an important site. And the presence of a multivalid ring fort further strengthens the fact that Ferns was a place of royal significance during the early medieval period. I'd just like to finish with a quote from the late Father Ransom, which I think is very suitable for the end of this conference. Although this is directed towards the restorations of Clone Church, I think it can go towards the general knowledge we've learned here today. Here we have attempted to restore something that was lost sight of and buried for ages. We are not indifferent to the men who have gone before us, nor to the monuments they have left behind them. We are the growth of past generations. From them we have our life, which is left of what is left of our language, our civilization, our culture, and our religion. And I'd like to thanks very much for that.